talk about this research in the Caribbean. And thank you all for attending and listening in our virtual world. I want to start by just acknowledging that this is not a solo endeavor here. I am part of a large collaborative team that's been working on this research and at this site. So while I'm speaking here, I'm representing the broader project. So I have several co-project investigators from Northwestern, Syracuse University, a local collaborator, Lennox Honeychurch of Island Heritage, and many local research assistants, partners, and students who have been working with us for many years and will be for some years to come. So let me just, okay. So in the 16th and 17th centuries in the Caribbean represent a period of really dynamic change. So European powers vied for access to resources and claims to territories. And during this time, indigenous societies and communities were assaulted, disrupted, and displaced. So in the years directly following Columbus's arrival, Spain and Portugal were really the big two influential colonial empires. They had ports throughout the Caribbean basin. But then beginning sort of in the late 16th century, Iberian trade ships became the target of privateers and pirates from England, France, and Holland. So the Dutch during this time kind of became the prominent trading power, especially in the 17th and 18th centuries. Trade was really their focus. And they established strategic settlements throughout the Caribbean. Then we see sort of this increasing European settlement, beginning in, say, the mid 17th century or so. And there's this really amplified focus on extractive economies and production. We think of sugar, right, as the kind of central focus within that economy. And you have the widespread importation of flora and fauna, of exotic biota, of all sorts of new ways of looking at the world and knowing, and all sorts of new materials coming in. Along with this rapidly shifting population demographic that included, we have voluntary immigrants, enslaved and free Africans, indentured servants from Europe, and of course, indigenous Americans. And then we have this sort of shift that takes place towards the very environmentally destructive plantation monoculture that peaks in the 18th and 19th centuries. And as these processes escalated, what we see in the Caribbean, and the same could be said for large swaths of the North American continent, is we have formerly indigenous landscapes undergo this significant transformations. You have ecosystem alteration, aquatic and island ecosystems change. You have whole communities that are transformed. And this is the context in which we've been doing this research, of course, during this early colonial period. I want to go back a little bit just because I know, oftentimes the talks here on Florida, I don't know how much people are familiar with sort of the history of the Caribbean. So one slide here to sum up about 6,000 years of history. But I want to give us a little bit of a picture of what was happening, before Columbus came into the Caribbean in the 15th century and, kind of shifted the trajectory of this entire region. So there were multiple migrations of different groups into the Caribbean archipelago. The first came from probably Mesoamerica over into Western Cuba about 6,000 years ago. So what we call the Archaic Age. This is followed by Arawakan cultural groups coming from the Orinoco Basin of Venezuela and the South American coast. Of course, they're getting into large canoes, so they had significantly sophisticated seafaring vessels at this point that could bring in 100 or plus people on these voyages. And so another wave kind of comes up about 2,500 years ago. Of course, during this time, you have several thousand years. It's not just some static. People aren't static. The cultures aren't static. People are moving in and out. There's sort of a trope or a theme in the history and archaeology of the Caribbean that the Caribbean Sea was a highway during this time. So it was really You know, just incredibly dynamic. People were continually interacting through trade, through marriage, through fusion and fission of groups. And that eventually forms into what we know as, in the Greater Antilles, the Taino societies. In the Greater Antilles and Leeward Islands. So the big islands up here that we know, the Greater Antilles, and then the northern of the Lesser Antilles, the Leeward Islands. So there's, you know, a lot of different groups occupying these areas. And the Windward Islands, where I'm focused on most of my research is focused in this area, were occupied by different groups of migrants from the Venezuelan coast. I'm sort of this third or fourth wave of migration from South America up into the islands, and about 600 years ago. So these groups in the Lesser Antilles were known kind of historically as the Island Carib, where the word Caribbean comes from, and now self-identify as the Coloniago. So you'll hear me refer to them, this group, throughout this presentation as Coloniago. So I guess overall, I just want to express how diverse the Caribbean was at the point of European contact. You know, very dynamic, focus on intra and inter-island trade, exchange, and movement between groups. People are just constantly coming up, over, in, out, throughout all the islands, right? So there's a lot happening. But I would say that trade and exchange are very central to most of the kind of cultural networks and things happening within the Caribbean. So then in the middle of the Lesser Antilles here, we have this small island of Dominica. Small island nation. It's going to be the focus of my talk today. As I see in this picture here, it's a lot of the Lesser Antilles, in particular the Windward Islands. It's a volcanic, very mountainous island. It sort of remains under-recognized, I think, but holds a very important place and is a significant locus of indigenous resilience and persistence in the Caribbean. So it's a really important place. So that's where we're going to focus our research today, is in Dominica and the Lesser Antilles. So I'm going to show a quick clip here of a film, and it'll all come together as to why, and the context will slowly come in as I talk more. But in 1949, there was a British film company that produced this movie that I think was largely panned, but called Christopher Columbus. They constructed replicas of the two of the ships in Barbados and sailed them to Dominica, to the shores of Dominica, where they filmed a reproduction of Columbus landing in the Bahamas, and meeting the indigenous Lucayan culture, peoples that were living in the Bahamas at the time. And so what you see here, I'm gonna push play, I guess, is the landing of the Columbus fleet. And these are actually local Coloniago people on the island of Dominica in the 1940s who are portraying the Lucayan in the Bahamas. And so these, the local indigenous communities here on a beach. And again, I don't know, there's no way anybody probably saw this movie. I think it did pretty terrible at the box office, but you see the sort of traditional landing of the fleets. Columbus comes off and, kneels and grabs some of the sand here. And so let's see, this all happens on the northeastern side of the island of Dominica at the point at Lasua Bay, which is the northeastern edge of the island. Right here, you can see that's a point here. It's a protected harbor. I'll talk more about that in a minute. And so this all happened in the 1940s on this site. I'm going to play one more clip as I'm talking. So our the project co-PI and local collaborator, Dr. Lennox Honeychurch, is a Dominican anthropologist, and his family lived right adjacent to where this film was being filmed at Lasua Bay. He still lives there and has some behind the scene footage. For example, this one here that his family had taken and saved for years. And so nearly 70 years later, Dr. Honeychurch walked along this beach after Hurricane Maria and saw, noticed some early colonial artifacts eroding from the shoreline. And so on this, where these scenes were filmed, on this site, the actors and the crew were standing on what we now know as the site of Lasua. site where early colonial settlers lived and traded with the ancestors of the Colonial about 300 to 400 years prior. So we have the portrayal here in the film that is, not shocking for the time, slightly biased with a colonial, slightly racist perspective. But in terms of Caribbean research, what we're interested in, sort of an enduring question for us, is the actual nature of these early colonial encounters. So as I'll talk about today, what are the small scale dynamics between indigenous communities and these European settlers who met in the Americas? Much of the historical record, of course, is focused or is written by literate Europeans. And that's all the recording that we have, right? So archaeology provides us a way to kind of counter the documentary record or fill it in and better understand the inner relationships and interactions between these groups. And these interactions are really salient in the Caribbean because there's this overall historical narrative that's been portrayed that these interactions were largely controlled and dominated by Europeans. And there's this emphasis on this mythologized idea of indigenous groups living on the islands at contact. I could play you a scene from Pirates of the Caribbean that would show, a particular depiction of indigenous Caribbean peoples at the time. So these mythologies, these sort of tropes that were started hundreds of years ago by the first European settlers on these islands have continued to this point. So part of the research in this project and others are to kind of, again, challenge these depictions and better understand what actually happened on the ground when we have indigenous and European groups interacting at the small scale. So we're working here, right at this point, literally right where these actors are sitting is where our research is continuing today. And as stated already, in 2017, Hurricane Maria became the first Category 5 hurricane to make landfall in Dominica in recorded history. So the hurricane devastated the island's infrastructure, the housing stock, economic base, and is one of many hurricanes, as we know, as Floridians, many of us, that reveals the vulnerabilities of small island states to climate change and threats to heritage resources along the coastline. In the site of La Soie here, you can see how close it was to the eye of this hurricane. So there was significant kind of damage and erosion on the beach caused by Hurricane Maria. And so on the same spot then that in 1949, those British filmmakers recreated their version of Columbus's landing sits the site of La Soie that we're talking about here. And as noted, it was first identified by Dr. Lennox Honeychurch eroding from the shoreline, after the storm surge from Hurricane Maria. And so he contacted COPI Mark Hauser to assist in the documenting of the endangered site. And Dr. Hauser and Dr. Doug Armstrong traveled to the site to initiate testing and conduct salvage archaeology in 2018. So during this initial testing, they identified material culture and a structural foundation that we've since interpreted as a European trading outpost established as early as potentially the 16th century based on carbon dating that we've done so far. And so you see again the actors of this movie, the site today, and this is a 3D model of the site from above. So I want to hop back again a little bit and give you some context for the island of Dominica, because it's sort of, I think, a lesser known place in the Caribbean in general, but again, has significance for the whole history of the region. So in 1493, the 3rd of November, it was the second voyage, and Columbus actually spotted the island of Dominica because if you come through with some of the prevailing trade winds, you actually end up going right through the Dominica Channel. And so he went by and named it Dominica. And as the story goes, when he went back to report from his second voyage, talking about the island, and he crumpled up a ball of paper and put it on the table to show how mountainous and rugged the landscape was. So we first see the label Carib for the indigenous peoples here, noted in accounts from Columbus's voyage and subsequent Spanish explorers to the Caribbean. and referred specifically to people inhabiting the islands east and south of Hispaniola, which on this 1594 very inaccurate map, right, would be about down here. So we have the first noting of these groups, and the subsequent narratives and mythologies included sort of this warlike and cannibalistic characterization, and that persists, as I said, into present perceptions of indigenous peoples in the Caribbean. And the contemporary Kalinago, specifically in the islands of St. Vincent in Guyana and in Dominica, are the descendants of groups indigenous to these islands. And they have lineages from pre and post-Columbian migrants and cultures from across the Greater and Lesser Antilles and the South American coast. And so, you have the Spanish coming in, of course, and the Spanish really were not focused on the Lesser Antilles. They remained primarily focused on the larger northern islands and mainlands. But because you have, groups of Kalinago, and Dominica had a lot of resources, it was used as a wood and water stop by the Spanish. And so the Kalinago really became integral in this early colonial period to the social and economic systems in the Lesser Antilles. And they maintained, control of several islands during this period, including Dominica, as they, also permitted European vessels to stop over. So they exchange things like fresh water and wood, foodstuffs like plantains, sweet potatoes, cassava, everything from bananas, tobacco, cotton, I could go on, turtle shell hammocks. And they would exchange these for things like, iron implements, knives, needles, hooks, hoes, hatchets, saws, griddles, and of course, the kind of traditional trade items like glass beads, trinkets, spirits, and even firearms. And so these exchange systems are really central. These trading moments, as we know, were really central to the relationships between indigenous groups and European traders. So in fact, by the time that we have Father Breton, who's a French missionary, come to Dominica, he created this Carib French dictionary in 1665. In it, the Kalinago groups on the island already had words for horses, cows, pigs, goats, rats, guns, knives, needles, plates, silver, and a ton of other things. Oh, and smallpox as well were already in their vernacular. And also during this period, it's very dynamic, right? There's a lot of threats to the livelihood of indigenous peoples. Of course, they're being raided to become slaves on various islands. And the Kalinago, particularly from Dominica, were also raiding northern islands and neighboring islands in the colonial period. And then we have, surviving Taino people coming down from the leeward and northern, the Greater Antilles. Kalinago groups are moving around. So, there's a lot going on, but plausibly in the 16th and 17th centuries, Dominica's population was probably a mix of, predominantly these ancestral Kalinago groups, some Taino, enslaved and free Africans, and Europeans. And so our research aims to kind of look at the material remains as a reflection of these demographics, right? These kind of multicultural demographics, and look at the socioeconomic and ecological kind of consequences of these interfaces in the Caribbean. So Dominica, along with St. Vincent, were declared under treaty by the English and French in 1660 as neutral. So as you see here, only missionaries were permitted by either colonial empire to settle on these island nations during this time. But, as we know, that what happens on paper does not happen in the real world, right? So during this time in the 17th century, Dominica is just immersed in these hostilities between the French and the English in particular, as they're battling for control of, islands in the Lesser Antilles and beyond. So we have from the 16th century, these small groups of dispersed traders and encampments and missionaries on the island of Dominica. So primarily, there were, again, these kind of missions that had plantations in the 17th century. But a lot of them were sort of what we might call pirates, traders, And they were taking advantage of this lack of colonial oversight on the island of Dominica and capitalizing on these trade networks that the Colonial had established. And just a note here on, on naming and what, definitions here. So what's a pirate, right? We sort of vaguely kind of include all of these different, I think, groups within that one category, but there's a lot of definitions here, right? We make pirates or sort of these illicit, informal sea bandits they weren't backed or sanctioned by any of the colonial powers to seize property or take, ships by force. Of course, you have then legally supported and sanctioned pirates who are privateers, who are, permitted and encouraged and sent out there by the colonial powers, especially Dutch, French, and English, to attack enemy ships. And they would have like a contractual share of the goods that they seized. Have people who are smuggling in illicit goods. Think about this time too. You have every colonial empire in the place has in place. They have particular trading laws and mercantilist policies going on, right? So there was a lot of legalities surrounding who could trade with who, what countries could trade with which, what island could trade with what. And so you have all these different kind of groups of traders, and pirates kind of evolved from this time, and there's a lot of different ones. But the important part, I think, is that whether we want to call them pirates or traders, that in all likelihood, this encampment that we see, this kind of informal encampment that starts out at the site, was likely, inhabited by traders, European traders of some sort, who we might call pirates. The location, where the site is. There's not really any other harbors on the Atlantic side of the island, so this would be one place people could come in. It was also sort of protected and hidden, but there wasn't much activity coming on this side of the island. There are some big ports on the Caribbean coast of the island, and so likely there's some illicit activity going on here, especially early on, right? So what's what we call maybe sort of a pirate or trading encampment. So we have then in the 16th and 17th centuries on Dominica and other islands on the Lesser Antilles too. I don't want to act like Dominica is this isolated space, because it's not. We have French, English, and Dutch sailors or traders, pirates, establishing these temporary shelters across the islands to facilitate trade and gain access to resources. These informal encampments would have then paved the way for more permanent settlements by the mid 17th century by Northern Europeans. Mm-hmm. So we suggest that La Soie was such a site where we have this informal European trading settlement established perhaps as early as the 16th century. And then we know it becomes a more formalized French outpost by the 18th century, when the French kind of attempt to somehow more formally take over the island in the mid 18th century. So the site again is on this really active channel, and you see in this image, right, it's this protected bay, which is super rare on the East Coast. It's very rugged, it's rocky, there's not good beaches or anything for people, or harbors for people to come into, natural harbors, that is, at this point. This is where, again, it's the first, one of the first sheltered anchorages actually for large vessels voyaging from Africa and Europe coming off the trade winds. And not too far to the south on the island at this time is where, sort of most of the Colonial were living and had sort of migrated to when Europeans started encroaching on the island. And then here I have a bit of information on the sites that had previously been identified in the area by a group from Leiden University in Holland. And they did some work and identified some colonial era or contact period indigenous sites in the region in Woodford Hill where we're working. So right next to and surrounding La Soie, this European encampment. And then of course, our research validates the presence of Colonial through the material culture I'll show you in a minute. And then we also, through testing and through excavation, have kind of identified an abandonment of this early settlement. Because what happens in 1727 is that the Imperial French presence increases, and they send officers to kind of build forts and things around the island, including one at La Soie. And so according to the historical books, this is when you see pirates vanish from Dominican ports, never to return. So, and we actually see that in the archaeological records. So sometime around the 1720s, there's a change, there's a sort of an abandonment, and then a occupation when the French take over the island, or try to, I should say, because then it goes to the English in the late 18th century. And so the major trade items at this time are tobacco and lumber, and water was a big trade item too for the islands. But our main question here then is centered on trade, right? And how this trade and exchange would have built alliances between the Colonial and European settlements, right? How these interactions would have been mutually beneficial. So here are we're starting to get into, I'll show some of the artifacts and stuff we're finding. So as I said, we did testing in 2018, my colleagues, and then we went back in 2019, supported by the National Geographic grant. And results of this show, again, based on carbon dating, an early date of sort of the 16th century, probably in 17th century is when it's at its peak. And we have early 17th century. And so we have material culture from all over, I'll show you in a minute. And initial interpretations are that it's a Dutch site. We'll see as we kind of uncover more as the project continues. But a lot of the artifacts are actually identifiable to this, what we call Kayo ceramic culture, that was first identified by the Leiden University folks that I talked about a minute ago. That sort of the Kayo would be really the ancestral Colonial. But they have this big sphere of interaction that's not just Dominica, but it goes through from Dominica down the Windward Islands and even into the Guianas as well. So you have groups moving in and out of these areas at the time, and you start to see a coalescence of particular ceramic styles, so pottery styles that are different from the pre-contact pottery styles on these islands. And so it's named the archaeological Kayo complex, but they're just the ancestors of the contemporary Colonial on the island, who we're still working with today, and we'll continue to when we get back to this project after a little bit of a slowdown since the pandemic. But we have been working with the Colonial and local community on this project to try and build a collaborative research effort on understanding this history. We have also done, I have a student, PhD student, Marie Miranda, who's working on an underwater survey of the bay to see if we can identify any material culture or potentially shipwrecks associated with the port. She's identified a few here or there. It's not great. The conditions are pretty bad. It's hard to see. It's a lot of action, underwater wave action and stuff. So she's continuing that research in hopes of kind of connecting that harbor and the underwater stuff with the terrestrial excavations we're doing. So far we've had 2 major seasons of excavation. This was the first one, sort of in 2018, just kind of salvage some things, figure out what was going on. And then we went back in 2019 and opened up a larger area. And this identified these structural foundations. So you can kind of see in the picture on the left, right, sort of a living floor. And then I'll show a different picture of what this is, sort of a raised platform. And we excavated that there. And so we're figuring there's this platform here in the shape like a D that we've identified, and sort of this living floor surface of some sort of structure associated with the trading factory at the time. And so you can see here we have this raised stone platform identified, and then surrounding it we have these post holes, 6 post holes surrounding the kind of extramural zone of this area. And all of throughout here, really associated with that living surface and the floors and below those surfaces as well, what we see are, a huge amount of European and indigenous materials, ceramics, faunal remains, pipes, bottles, all sorts of materials that can give us some insight into what was happening, between these groups at this particular site. So one of the most, and this is not too uncommon and not too surprising, but one of the most common artifacts we find are kaolin pipes on the site. And this is, I mean, it's not a surprise for a lot of reasons. One, that in colonial era archaeological sites, this is probably one of them. They're one of the most common artifacts found in general. And two, I mean, this, we're talking about sort of the ground zero of tobacco, right? And the tobacco trade in the Caribbean, you know, as tobacco was a Native American domesticate, right? And so that was one of the main commodities traded by indigenous peoples in the Caribbean. And so this new form, you know, and so we bring in this easily accessible, mass-produced way to ingest or inhale tobacco. And so we just see a lot of these. Most of them are Dutch, most pipes of this time were produced in Holland. So this is not very uncommon. We have a lot of bowls, you know, dozens and dozens of pipes, really. And a significant amount of them date before the 1720s and 30s, that time period when we think there was a shift in occupation at the site. So you can tell what these, they often have maker's marks on them, and the shape of the bowl is how you can identify where and who made these particular pipes. We've found a lot of artifacts associated with guns and ammunition and various other things. Again, not a surprise. It was a very precarious position, right, for both the Europeans and the Colonial, right, during this period. We have just so much, so many threats coming in, you know, not just from the English and French, but from many other groups throughout the region. And so we see, you know, for example, we have the first year they found a mold for gun, for lead shot on the site. We found, you know, some possibly kind of smaller cannons, a lot of gun flints. This in particular, we know this is a French gun flint. I don't know, for those of you who might not be familiar, there's particular characteristics that we can use to identify where gun flints actually came from, because the silicate, the raw material that they use is going to vary depending upon where it was produced. And so this sort of amber colored, awkward gun flint is a French gun flint. Your English producer, they're like more of a slate gray appearance, and they have sort of a different structure or shape to them. So by far, the largest component from the excavations was this pottery made by, you know, the indigenous peoples of Dominica, you know, identified as American Indian. They're Amerindian pottery. There are some of the sherds that we found date to earlier, so they look more like pre-contact ceramics. And this isn't surprising. There are on the site and all around. There are people living in the area, you know, for some time. So we have pre-contact settlements in the area. But we're really interested at this site, you know, in these what we call kayo ceramics. So as I said before, the kayo is really just something that a category that archaeologists made to help define these ceramics that we start to see in the contact period in the islands of the Lesser Antilles and down into the Guianas. Produced by indigenous peoples as they're sort of merging together for, you know, safety and culturally and all sorts of things. So we see this change and this coalescence of this particular type of pottery that's this low-fired coarse earthenware, you know, it looks, you know, similar to maybe indigenous pottery you find in Florida, except for the shape and decoration are very different. So they're characterized by a quartz-tempered low-fired paste. They're coil produced, open fired. They have this sort of either like reddish, orange to black color. And they often are in small jars, sort of like this one. And there's often its out curving rim at the top. And then these are forms that you don't necessarily see in abundance before contact. And so these are really, you know, some telling about the site. We're finding these mixed in with all the European materials, right? And so, oh, and sometimes I forgot about the little, these little nubbins. So little like handles or nubbins towards the top of the rim is very common in what we call Kaio or ancestral Colonial ceramics versus the pre-contact ceramics. So these are just examples of some that we found compared to the ones that were sort of the first identified of this particular type of ceramic. So these, then the indigenous produced ceramics are mixed in at the site with, a fair amount of European ceramics. So we have imported European and Asian trade ceramics. And many of you, I'm assuming, watched a lot of these talks here and are aware of how we can use these particular artifacts to help us date and determine, who was living at the site or where these artifacts at least were coming from, where they were produced and coming in from. And one kind of really neat thing we found, that they found the first year, but was more or less a pile of Delft ceramics. So Delft is a tin enameled ware from Holland. It was the most common ceramic at the site, which again is one of the reasons we think it's potentially Dutch. But it was a common ceramic sort of all around, so it's hard to say. But we sort of found these plates of all these Delft broken in situ, which can suggest sort of maybe a quick abandonment. Might also suggest that this outpost had sort of a little tavern or something, so where people were eating or fed when they came to trade in some way. And I'll show you another indication of that as well in a minute. So Delft is the most common, and then we also have a common ceramic is the analogous ceramic created by the French, which is faience. So tin enameled ware, and then various French coarse earthenwares, super common. So we're seeing ceramics coming from all over. And then in the more recent levels, we have some of the English wares like slipware found as well. And this might suggest that shift that happens in the late 18th century when the English claim the island and bring, just attempt really to create the focus on sugar monoculture like they had on other islands, and it doesn't do very well because of the geography of the island and various things. But needless to say, so we start to see more English ceramics in the upper levels, when there's more interaction with the English folks. So these are all found like either within that floor or kind of outside of that area, along with tons of other items, and I'll show you a few of them here. So one of the interesting things we found here, what we call syncretic forms of pottery. So when we refer to syncretic forms, it's just that these are materials that show sort of a hybridization of different cultural traditions. And this is sort of common. We see this in the southeastern United States happen at contact when you have indigenous groups that start to actually produce ceramics locally that mirror or reflect European styles of production or form. And so we start to see these bowls appear at the site, and that is not a sort of what we might call indigenous form of pottery or whatever, that is more European-like in style. And so these are novel forms, right, that are produced from the interaction and the merging of different cultural traditions through these encounters. And it's sort of unclear how they get there, but one hypothesis is that these were created and maybe exchanged or traded with the Europeans at the site to appeal to their taste and standards, right, that they were used to. So bowls or whatever they were using to eat out of during this time period. We also found a lot of beads, both locally created beads like out of shell and other things, and then imported beads like here that date from 17th, 18th centuries. This is a particular style. It's called a carnelian bead. Possibly comes from South Asia. There are also some sources of it in South America, so it's a little unclear. We could probably have some sourcing done on it. Have yet to do that. But it's a very kind of common type that we find on historical sites in the early colonial period in various places in the New World. And also just trade beads in general, right? So as many of you probably know, the Dutch, Spanish, English, French all had use these European glass trade beads and exchange them because they were highly desirable items, and exchange them for whatever they needed, commodities they needed, and services. And then in West Africa, they traded them for things like enslaved peoples. So very, highly regarded commodity that could be exchanged for, whatever the Europeans were looking for. Then again, mixed in with all of this, we have clearly, indigenous produced materials that are, very similar to things that would have been made in the pre-contact area in the Lesser Antilles. Little things like shell ornaments. We found, I think, 4 of these particular ones so far that our community collaborators identified as a mourning dove. That's sort of an important bird on the island. And so we found, a bunch of this stuff as well. So again, indigenous produced at the site, whether it's from, an actual indigenous person or European, they traded it with Europeans, to be determined. And then also we find things like copper, ornaments, other things that have been perforated to wear in some way. And so historically, in the historical record, we see that these exchanges between colonial settlers and indigenous groups, the most prominent European trade wares were beads and hawk bells. They call this sort of the standard European gift kit, historians and archaeologists. So things that were hard, luminous, lustrous, made of glass or metal, things that in the pre-contact period were sort of considered really important material traits, that is. And they would have, it would have been exchanged if they were exotic materials, raw materials that were made into this. So these beads and bells and ornaments and things translated very well into indigenous systems of value and culture. And so they were they just fell into these trade items that were very sought after. But of course, other items that would have been traded, like, food, clothing, weapons, and personal items of all nature were there. So really quickly, I'll discuss here my one of my personal contributions to this. So I also, as well, running projects and things, my specialty is faunal analysis. So looking at animal remains from archaeological sites to understand, diet and environment and all those things. So I've analyzed a samples of the vertebrate faunal remains recovered. And these include really both imported European animals and indigenous fauna as well. So domestic European herbivores like sheep and goat, domestic pig and domestic cattle, and of course domestic bird chicken as well, right, which was brought really early and would have been brought on like every trading ship coming across the Atlantic. Eggs are a great resource, right, for people to have this a consistent food item. So chickens were consistently brought, as were sheep and goats and all the above. And so we also see here an abundant, various types of aquatic or marine fauna consumed at the site. So we have sea turtle. This is probably before European really trade of sea turtle meat developed, and there was overhunting of sea turtles like sort of in the middle and late colonial period. So we still have some sea turtle, a variety of fish taxa, some that we'd see in the Gulf here, not shockingly, right? Grouper and snapper and grunts, and some of the more kind of tropical fish there would be like parrotfish and triggerfish, right? So some of the similar things that people would have eaten here do eat here. And also I found one little bitty iguana bone, and a lot of crab. They were consuming a lot of the land crab. That was, again, a common food item of the time. But so interestingly, when we break it down a little for you, this is the cow versus the sheep and goat. So when I look at these animals, I look at the different elements that are represented. What bones are present from these particular animals in the assemblage I'm looking at? And so when I look at the sheep sheep goat, which are hard to tell difference osteologically, versus the cattle, there's a different pattern so far. And that is, I'm not finding any like feet or head elements from the cattle, but I am of the sheep and goat. So what that suggests to me, as somebody who's been doing this research for a while, is that the sheep and goat were probably raised on the island. So they were brought over and they started to, have small animal husbandry at the site and around it. And then the beef, though, on the other hand, was probably imported. So they had barreled beef at this time, was a very common food item for Europeans, and on plantations and things as well. So just an interesting, diversity there. The pig I have found teeth and stuff from, so I assume those are also brought. We know that the Spanish brought a ton of pigs over and just let them loose basically on a lot of islands. So then we also find an abundance of shellfish, which some of these, again, you all will recognize, some you might not. But we have over 30 species of shellfish identified at the site. And I mean, when I tell you a lot of shellfish, it's sort of, some of these are not quite midden like you have in Florida, but for me as an historic Caribbeanist, they're eating a lot of shellfish. And they're dominated in particular, there's some conch here that take over this picture, of course, but they're not very common. There's only a few that we've identified on the site. So most of them are this West Indian top shell, right? It's a really common food in the prehistoric and colonial Caribbean. The nearites here, these little guys that you just, kind of throw in a stew, basically. And limpets, these guys here. So those are the most common shellfish that we find at the site. And these were all, like, a lot of them really are kind of, they like rocky and sandy bottoms, depending upon the species. So you can literally walk around the site today and you're, walking on top of a lot of these species that are sitting there. So these are all just available right within the bay, as were the fish on the other slide as well, right? So people are just, the people who are settlers there just fishing and shell fishing right off the bay. And obviously, we're seeing this kind of, we might call a syncretic cuisine as well at the site, right? So we're seeing this mix of things they would have been familiar with from Europe brought over, and then also the introduction of new foodstuffs that they kind of like start eating and integrating into their diet when they move here. So here we have a close-up of a broken pot. And this, you can see here, is all like this busted up pot. And here are a bunch of those shellfish I just showed you, right? So we have nearites and limpets. And what it seems to be is literally sort of a pot that either they had collected shellfish in, maybe, and that had broken and stayed in place. So again, this sort of points to that potential quick abandonment of the site, maybe when the French, again, sort of tried to formally occupy the area. Not really sure. So we'll see going forward if we see more evidence of that. That's what we've been finding so far. In 2021, we hit some challenges a little bit in heading out. We were supposed to have another field season, wrapping some things up, but it turned out that COVID would get in our way. And so we were only able to kind of do a little bit of survey and mapping. So you see here what we've been doing. Part of this research project too, I sort of should note this, I guess, going forward, is sort of documenting the destruction of this heritage site, the erosion of it on the coastline from storm surge and activities from increasing, hurricane and other activity occurring on the islands, right? As we know, these small islands, the Caribbean, are particularly vulnerable, right, to climate change, the consequences of climate change, including, coastal erosion and other things impacting the coastlines, but also impacting things like heritage and heritage sites. And so you'll see in the center picture here is us doing some mapping of that, the shoreline right at the site so that we can see, year to year how much is being eroded from the shore with, storm activity and other things. So that's part of what we were doing this year, is mapping that in, and also kind of mapping in some of the features we didn't get to last time. So this is a bollard that is part of the anchorage that was probably set up, in the maybe 16th or 17th century, and has stood the test of time and is still there several centuries later. It's a faraway picture, but you can kind of see it standing up here. It's a metal thing just poking out of the rocks, right, that people would have anchored onto. And then the second part of, other part of what we were doing this summer too, was trying to document some of the potential other features of the settlement. And so we did identify what we think was a church that would have been associated with maybe that later French settlement on the island. That is marked on some of the maps I have it right here that I can show. So here we have this, the anchor would have been kind of right off here. This is, again, an early map, not to scale at all, right? So, but the bollard would have been right up here, and then this is a marking of a church. And so we went up in this area and tried to find it, and lo and behold, we found, evidence of, potentially late 18th century material culture, and a couple sort of wall lines that would have outlined this church in the bush a little bit up here. And so we're continuing to do this and survey and map the area and see other places that might be interesting to excavate that are associated with this settlement and the change over time, right? Because it's not, I like to think of everything as sort of over the long term, right? We have indigenous occupation, and then this early European encampment, then this French occupation, then the English, right? This is a really long-term history of this site that we can talk about all those changes and shifts that happened. We are headed back down, fingers crossed, this upcoming summer, if everything goes right, to continue our work there, and particularly focus on remote sensing, some aerial LiDAR, GPR and magnetometry, ground penetrating radar and magnetometry, to try and identify areas that we can really target and hone in on. Of course, we can't excavate everything, so we're trying to figure out where we should focus our efforts. So using remote sensing will hopefully help us identify those areas where we might have site features that we can't see, just by pedestrian survey. And we're also good. So, I should probably show you too. So the bollard, where am I? The bollard for the anchorage is right out here, I think. Marie's probably going to kill me because I'm probably pointing to the wrong area. But this is taken from out looking in onto the bay where the boats would have actually anchored. And there's been some mining of some of the rock up on this area, which is why it looks like it does. But we mapped in this area, so part of what we're doing. And so, yeah, so we're going to come back down, do some additional survey. In particular, maybe look for evidence of Colonial residences and villages around the area to see if we can look more at that kind of interaction and that, how this actually happened with the establishment of the settlement. If there were, Colonial communities nearby, what that interaction looked like. And so, as I said, we're also interested in this, looking at kind of climate change, but also just generally looking at the socio-ecological history of this site. So with all these changes, you have changes in the nature of the relationships between the people occupying this bay and the landscape, the bay itself, the land and the water. And people change it in various ways. So we're really interested in looking at these changes over time. So we'll be doing some with a team from Eckerd College, hopefully. We're doing some soil sampling and looking at the history of the bay in that sense, and also looking at the paleobotanical record with some colleagues to understand the plant side. I do the animal, we need the corresponding plant person or persons to work on, understanding the vegetative changes that have happened. And, when we have plantation agriculture come in, what happened to the landscape. So looking at those long-term socio-environmental changes. So hopefully things will be, looking better next year, and we can go back to further delineate and characterize this site. yeah, so we're really trying just to connect this generally to larger questions of these interactions between indigenous groups and European settlers on the Caribbean frontier. So just to pull it back to the beginning, right, this is a place that's sort of outside of the colonial gaze a little bit. It just wasn't an area that until maybe the mid 18th century, any of the colonial powers were attempting to occupy in any major way, right? And so what happens, when you have the strong indigenous presence, the persistence and resilience of these cultures and communities on an island, and you have these, Europeans coming in, and what relationships are built, and how does that happen? Within these broader entanglements of colonialism, ecological transformations, as you have encroaching European formal colonization. So we're continuing to do this research moving forward. And I just want to thank everybody for coming again. I want to thank National Geographic Society, the University of South Florida, Dr. Linus Honeychurch, Irvin Soglist, the Colinago community, Corinne Hoffman, Menno Hooglin, all of our students, all of our local partners, collaborators, and workers in the community of Woodford Hill for welcoming us and taking part in our efforts. And I think that's it.